Okay, so starting with thinking about some of these inner motivations, I found it very striking what a large proportion of the women you spoke to were religious. I can't be sure off the top of my head what proportion. I mean, what do you know what proportion roughly?
In my sample,
Hmm.
religious, yeah, 98%. I
Yeah,
mean,
basically
so
everyone.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
basically everyone. And as you saw, I mean, I included my best counterexample, right? Because it's very important for my argument that that it's not religion per se, but it's the content of religion, right? And so the not all religion, the content of the particular faiths that these women live. And so my counterexample, the least religious woman that I interviewed, she becomes really important for unpacking that. Yeah.
Do you want to talk more about your counterexample as maybe the exception that proves the rule?
Yes, she's wonderful. I mean, they're all wonderful. I enjoyed these interviews so much. Um, uh, yeah, Lauren is my counterexample, and she has a great story. And she says, "Well, you know what were her motives?" And her motive was that that her husband wanted 9 children. So, and she doesn't have a great explanation for it. She and her husband are Jewish. They keep a Jewish household, but they're not, what you would maybe from the outside consider terribly devout. And I'm not, putting down her faith. They identify as Jewish, but she says to me right away at the beginning of the interview, the having 5 children, which they had 5 at the time of the interview, the having 5 children is distinct from the Jewish part. Like we these are 2 separate pieces of our lives. Whereas nobody else that I talked to probably would have said that, would have presented a clean distinction. And so, of course, my job as a researcher is to take her at her word. She more or less laughed off the idea that children are blessings. Yeah, but she's great. But her husband really wanted 9 children. And so she has a very humorous way of talking about how, after one, it was the second. But she says, well, I don't know if it was hormones or something that, my husband wanted 9 and that wasn't going to be a problem for me. And so when I interviewed her, she has 5. And we don't know the end of the story. We don't know if she ends up having 6 or 7 or 8. Um, but what I argue in her chapter is that what it helped me to see um, that what I found over and over in these interviews is that there's some positive description of value that people are moving towards. Um, so she has 5 children at the time of the interview, not because she wants them, but because her husband wants them, and it's something she understands she can do for him. We press her on this, like, well, why really? Like, I mean, if you just would have stopped at 3, which is what she says, like, why really? And she says, well, he has everything else that he wants. I mean, he has a great job. They're very successful. She says, at the end of the day, this is what I can give to him. So it has all this value. I call it relationship value. It has all this value for her because this is something that he wants. Now, we know that it's incredibly rare today for a woman to be married to a man who wants 9 children.
Mm.
That's incredibly rare, but that's the source of value that she's moving towards, right? It's not a sense of, God is engaged in the creation of the world and that God thinks children are wonderful and that my own heart has been shaped by God's image of the world and the goodness of the world, which I heard from so many other people. But it was this very, I think, really charming and straightforward. My husband loves this. He can't wait till we have a whole house full of these babies. And so I thought, okay, that's the thing, right? It's always this kind of very simple, I mean, I think easy to understand. The benefits outweigh the costs, but not costs and benefits assessed in sort of mere economic terms, relationship terms, lifestyle terms, right? So for her, it was, in a sense, relationship terms provided so much value as to get her past that, that barrier of 4 or 5, 6 children. And that really stood out. So I thought, okay, wait a second. I could go back and I can look at these religious stories and I can see that same depiction of some very um, precious kind of value, right? So there's a value here. And the reason I presented these in the context of what we call motive is I would say these are the kinds of things that got people thinking at the beginning, maybe I'd like to have more. I'm open to having more than, my neighbor next door. Some very clear articulation that this is an activity worth doing. I separated the motive in that sense, the clear conception of the value of children for relationship, for spirituality, for a good life, right? I separated that from kind of what keeps people going, because very often those things were slightly different. And so even Lauren, who begins with I'm doing this for my husband, she starts to articulate, oh, but there's so much goodness in this life. And as she starts to experience it, that and lots of the other women said the same thing. I got going for maybe idealistic reasons. We had principles we believed in, that this is what our marriage was for instance. But as we kept going, my goodness, I just fell in love with babies. Or as we kept going, I just saw how much joy this brought. So what gets you from 5 to 10 if you have time? Those are these outliers. Even in my sample, they're the outliers. What gets you there? Well, what gets you there is, after you've gotten started out of reasons of principle, you just discover there are these hidden rewards in this life. And if you still have time, boy, you just get one more. You ask for one more. And that was that was to me kind of the surprising part of this.
And how did the women tend to think about politics and about feminism? Because Lauren's comment there, particularly about wanting to please her husband by giving him so many children, that's a very countercultural thing to say, right? At least in more sort of
Right.
liberal feminist
Right.
circles. How did your interviewees tend to relate to that as a question?
That's a great question. Of course, I didn't go in with a set of interview questions about politics or ideology, but it came up. I mean, so I think at one point I say that they don't mention politics much at all or philosophy, except occasionally they say feminism. I mean, and typically in a pejorative fashion. So at some point I asked them, well, why do you think other women don't do what you do? So I wanted to get their sense of why their lifestyle choices were so uncommon. Um, Not that we're not full of theories about that, and not that the women's ideas wouldn't be their own theories in a sense, but I thought it was very interesting. And so many of them said, oh gosh, I think it is feminism. I think it's this idea that a woman can't be fulfilled or isn't fulfilled without a kind of career or some kind of more male coded way of life. So many of them brought that up. But there's another part of your question, which I think is very interesting, and I should mention it because we were just talking about Lauren, who speaks about having a lot of children as a way of giving something to her husband that he wants. And that language, I would say, was very interesting to me. And in the context of this big demographic question, I want to say that a topic that's been really underexplored by academics, we say demographers and academics, is the extent to which the patterns we see aren't in fact women giving men what they want in a sense, right? So in one sense, we can say, okay, well, Lauren's husband wanted 9, and that's a neat thing. It's an unusual thing. Well, how many children do men typically want, right? So we don't know the answer to that. It's very interesting. So a feature of the sort of feminist nature of, I would say, research in the academy in the last 40 or 50 years is that a lot of this research has kind of assumed that the number of children that are born is just exactly the number of children that women want. Right. So the feminist approach to maybe some of these questions actually kind of bakes in an assumption that we don't know if it's true or not. And it's funny. It's a curious assumption. It's an assumption that is exactly not what feminists have tended to think. Feminists have tended to think that women are kind of ruled by the patriarchy and told, right. And I actually tend to think there's something pretty natural about looking to please your partner. So I think that's something that whether we want to or not, we often do. I think we as women, I think it's, and that of course can be good and it can be terribly bad if our partners are not men of character, right? And so, in fact, when we sort of hear these ideas, like women maybe who say, I'd like to have had more children, but I got less than I wanted, we know that there's something to this story right now. To what extent are women dealing with partners who don't want as many children as they would want? And we don't, amazing, we just don't know the answer to that. So that's a long way of answering your question. In general, the women did think that some kind of version of feminism was part of the story of women not sort of setting out to make their lives. We'll just, so again, it's not rejecting a career. It's like not setting out to make your life flexible in the kind of way that you could welcome children. So that seemed to be sort of the theme. And so a lot of them blamed feminism for that. And so, yeah, so right, there's a lot to unpack there.